And I want to start, first of all, by thanking Ann Hyde and Julia Brookins and Nike Navarre, who are really the three people who are making this happen. But actually, Ann and Julia and Nike aren't really the ones who are making this happen. It's all of you. And we're very appreciative of that. We thank you for the time, the energy that you're putting in. We thank you for your commitment to teaching. Academia is an odd place, especially those of us who have partners who are not academics. We sometimes get a sense of these sorts of things. And one of them is, I'm very curious, how many of you, when someone's asked you what you do, you've said, well, I teach X, Y, and Z, and my own work is on A, B, or C. How many of you have done that? Yeah. And how many of you know anybody else in any other profession who uses that term? You don't. My own work. My own work is not teaching. My own work, I teach this, and this. But my own work is on. So we make this distinction between kind of what we're paid to do and something that we call my own work. And so what I really appreciate, and the AHA really appreciates, is that you do care about your teaching, and you do care about what we actually get paid to do, which is to teach. That's what our institutions are actually paying us for. Although obviously research is important, and you are paid also to be scholars who do research, but especially those of us who teach at tuition-driven institutions, it's that tuition that's paying you. Public universities, yes, public research universities, research is important. I don't demean research, but the public thinks we're being paid to teach. And if we don't remember that, I think we forget it at our peril. And so I appreciate the fact that this is a group of people who cares. This is very important to the AHA. This is a project I think is very different from things that the AHA has done before. We've been interested in teaching, obviously, for a long time. We have a teaching division. But the AHA has always, and I'll get to this in a little bit for good reason, shied away from anything that looks like we're creating standards, looks like we're setting some kind of framework that people have to fit into. And that's as it should be. But any of you who have friends on campus who are chemists, for example, know that if your major is not certified by the American Chemical Society, no students, basically. You have to be certified. We don't do that sort of thing for good reason, but I think we also sometimes kind of shy away of playing a leadership role in what we do. This afternoon, as I was listening to those wonderful summaries of what the groups did, somebody asked what success would be. And I thought that since the AHA does have this grant from the Lumina Foundation, we probably ought to know what success is. Especially since what we're asking you to do is come up with outcomes-based curriculum. Or to think about what it means to teach history when we're thinking about outcomes. So, well, we better have an outcome in mind too. So here's what I think success is. Success is for 60 departments, or in some cases clusters, because I know some of you are in institutions that don't have a history department, to collaborate with members of 60 different departments to collaborate on a reconsideration of their history major focused on student outcomes rather than focused on a set of courses that we would like to teach. To take collective ownership over what our students learn. Collective ownership within a department. And with those outcomes framed in part on input from members of the communities that matter to your institution. Alumni, employers, the institutions that together constitute what we might call civic culture, parents, students. How many of you talk to parents? This is something that really surprised me when I started talking to people, and people said, well, you know, parents come in and see me and want to know why, what their kid's going to get from a history major. I think this is something that's happening more now than it did 20 or 30 years ago. And we decry it to some extent. We talk about the helicopter parents. But it's also a good thing, because I think that it also means there's more first-generation college students. First-generation college students' parents want to know, what are we as a family getting into here? And people whom I've talked to about this have affirmed my guess, which is that it is often the first-generation students whose parents come in and talk to you. My son wants to major in history. What's he going to do with it? That's something that a first-generation college student parent cares about. And we have to take those parents seriously. And we have to take seriously the employers in our communities who we're hoping will employ our students. Now, I realize that including employers in this is controversial. And the AHA has had some criticism in the blogs on this. To some of our colleagues, this is caving into vocationalism. And I just came from a conference a fascinating conference on some issues relating to this, where a philosopher at a major R1 university, young, brilliant philosopher, who had all sorts of interesting ideas. But one of them was that we as humanists have to make sure that we maintain the distinction between economic and instrumental values and humanistic values. And I thought, no, that's not what we need to do. We need to do actually just the opposite. We need to figure out where the economic and the instrumental intersect with humanistic values. If we want to have some influence, if we have the confidence to believe that the humanities have something to contribute to various parts of the world, if we want to argue, Julianne and I were talking before about her governor, if we want to argue with Governor Scott and say, no, the humanities are useful, that's part of what we want to argue, is that these worlds are not far apart, that in fact they intersect, that the business world will benefit from the presence of our students. And we're not chasing our students away. So we need to listen to them. To our students, to their parents, it's important to know that the history major has value to a student's career, and it's important for employers to know that our students can do the things that they want. Now, maybe the value is not for the first job. I think arguably for many of our students, their first job is a job where they're taught what they need to learn on the job. But the second job, or the third job, one of the things, for example, that our students learn is about change. We're historians. We know more about how change happens than anybody else in the world. That's what we do. It's what we study. It's what we understand. And I think arguably, leadership in any institution, private, nonprofit, public, has to do with understanding change, has to do with making change, or preventing change sometimes. We hope not very often, but it is about understanding how change happens and the different ways in which change can happen. And that's what we teach. It's what our students learn, I think. So we need to be thinking about how we can communicate to employers that our students have these skills, have this knowledge. It's nice to think of the humanities as a set of disciplines that considers, comments, and criticizes from the outside. And it's valuable. And if the academy doesn't do that, our society is in trouble. But we also need to have the confidence that we're teaching things that we want future business and civic leaders to know and understand. We need to stop dichotomizing preparation for citizenship and preparation for career. And we need to flex our muscles rather than complain that we're becoming irrelevant to the new generation of career-oriented students. And that's why the AHA is doing this. Because we think that history is related not only to citizenship, but is also related to students' careers, to all aspects of our students' lives inside and outside the academy. And it's also why Tony Grafton and I have been arguing the same thing about the PhD, which is a separate set of questions. So that's one issue, is we are not taking money from anybody who is telling us anything to do. It's a foundation grant. Good foundations fund projects that do many different things. And that gets us to another objection, which is the concern about top-down assessment and top-down definition of outcomes. This is especially a concern on the West Coast, I know, with the accreditors. And Lumina has apparently funded some projects with accreditors which do have probably a larger amount of externally defined metrics than the AHA would ever consider to be acceptable. That is not what we are doing. We are not telling anybody what to do. In fact, that's one of the reasons why we're building this from the bottom up. We're not saying, here is a literature, and we're going to throw it at you. It's an existing literature, and we want you to take it back to your campuses. We're trying to model what we want you to do, which is building this from the bottom up. This is faculty-driven. Anything that happens on any campus involved in this project will depend upon the mission of that college or that university, and any conversations with other stakeholders will be determined by the community in which that college or university exists, and people define their communities in different ways. One of the reasons why we're going to be bringing in a public historian to talk about collaboration between local public history institutions and your institutions is that public history institutions are fabulous links. They're not just places for internships, which is what we usually think about them as. But remember, public history institutions have boards. The people who are on those boards control jobs. The people who are on those boards are part of that business and professional and civic community. So the public history institutions provide these kinds of links. And the whole idea here is for you to figure that out about how that works for your college or university, rather than be told how to do it through some pre-existing literature, some set of directives, some set of metrics. So what Lumina is allowing us to do, I would argue, is to do differently what they're doing, to do something differently from how they are funding it in other places. And our goal is to show them that this works. That faculty-driven, locally controlled definitions of outcomes and assessment can work. That you can create a rigorous, useful major using this method. To suggest that we would plan curriculum according to desired outcomes and to be able to assess how well we're doing should not be considered a threat. It should be thought of as an opportunity to do what we do more effectively, to learn from ourselves, to continue to be learners. It does mean rethinking what good teaching is, from thinking about process to thinking about outcomes. And I have always been, now that I've never thought about this, quite frankly, until recently, I have always, as a teacher, been completely guilty of emphasizing process rather than outcome. I see some people shaking their heads. I would teach a class, go home. Usually one member of my family was sufficiently interested to ask, how did class go? And I always would say, oh, it was great. 80% of the students participated, or, today was a bomb, 3 people participated, we didn't really discuss anything. Process. I don't think I ever said, well, yeah, it was really good because here's what I thought I was intending to do for the last 2 weeks, and we're sort of halfway there. I never said that. And I don't think I ever have had a syllabus that really talks about the outcome of a course. I know that I've never had a syllabus that talks about how a course fits into the larger curriculum of the institution, ever. So this is what we're trying to be thinking about. We talked about this at dinner a little bit, for example. How many of you have interviewed potential new faculty? How many of you have ever asked one of those potential new faculty, so we've been thinking about our curriculum, and we've had some of our colleagues have concerns. What do you think of our curriculum? Yeah, not very many. We don't train our graduate students to think about it, and we don't think about the notion that there's some kind of collectively determined curriculum that has an outcome that we desire for our students. So this is why the AHA is doing this. This is what we'd like to see happen. Now, another issue I heard raised this afternoon real quickly is majors versus students. Some questions there. And I think that there's a way to parse this, and what I would very strongly suggest is that your department approach these issues separately, except where you don't have a major. In other words, there's one set of meetings that we need to have a department have that talks about rethinking the major. This is what we want the major to accomplish. This is how we can figure out how to assess whether we are accomplishing it. This is how we're going to do it. Then there's another set of conversations, which the AHA also is very interested in, especially our incoming president, Ken Pomerantz, who has already said to me, we need a follow-up project. And that is, what are our goals for the people we teach who are not majors? It's a different set of questions, because it's a different set of opportunities, different set of constraints. I think we've got to think of those separately. We're all historians in this room. We are all, and that's our discipline, is history. It's not our profession, because there's lots of professions that historians do. They're museum curators, they're archivists, those are different professions. They're still historians. We're all historians. But in this room, we also all have one profession, which is post-secondary teaching. And what we have to remember is that our students, we're not training our students to be either of those things. That's graduate school. We're training them to do many other things, to be able to do many other things. We need to think about our major that way. Disciplinary societies like the AHA are the right places to start to think about this. And that's because it's in disciplinary societies that historians can learn from one another, much more so than we can on our own campuses. In part because there's more of us, but also in part because we're less vulnerable. It's very hard sometimes to learn from your colleagues. It's very hard to admit to your colleagues you don't know something. Sometimes it's very hard to take a colleague's advice, power relationships, other issues. It's much easier to learn from one another in the context of a disciplinary society. So what I'm hoping is that this is a place where we can learn from one another, and that the AHA can help people to think about how we learn from our colleagues beyond the academy, in part because we have historians beyond the academy in the AHA. Our colleagues in the AHA do include public historians, which is usually not the case on our campuses. So I'm hoping that this is a venue for learning. I'm hoping that this project can help us think more effectively about the AHA as an arena for professional development focused on learning and teaching. I'm also hoping, and this came out of a session that I was chairing at our meeting in Boston in 2011 on assessment. Carol Lasser, who at the time, maybe she still is chair of the department at Oberlin, said that she hoped everybody who was at that session would figure out, and it's not hard to find out, how to sign up to be on an accreditation team. How many of you have been on an accreditation team? Is it worth other people doing? Yeah. And your institution, in fact, presumably would support this, because then when the accreditors come, you kind of already done it, you have a sense of how this works. But it is the way for us to exercise influence in this process. One of the things that's really interesting to me as a historian, especially given the kind of work that I've done, is that we think of ourselves as victims. We think of ourselves as victims of accreditors. We think of ourselves as victims of a society that doesn't value the humanities. And yet, most of us in this room, when we write and teach, we talk about agency. Last 30 years, slaves have agency, serfs have agency. Now, animals have agency. Everybody has agency. I was at a conference a few years ago where I said, actually, I want to draw a moratorium on the argument they had agency. That argument is no longer acceptable because it's obvious. And yet we see ourselves as people without agency. And I think this is what we have to move away from. Okay, that's enough from me. You want to know what the AHA thinks, that's what the AHA thinks. I'm here to introduce two people, which will surprise you because you think I'm here to introduce only one. So I'm first going to introduce Patricia Nelson Limerick, who is the faculty director and chair of the board of the Center of the American West, which I should say has been referred to publicly by Professor Limerick as, and I quote, an agile armadillo. I think this is the first time any of you have been addressed by someone who runs an institution called an agile armadillo. She is also a professor of history at the University of Colorado and has taught at Harvard University as well. Born in Banning, California, which, again, among the very few historians who has actually written about what that means in an article called Banning Writ Large. So today I tried to find out how big Banning was at the time I grew up there. And I couldn't get the information out of the census, but fortunately I ran into a guy from Southern California and I asked him. And he said, well, it was small. He said, it was the kind of place that Spencer Tracy in Bad Day at Black Rock would have gone to visit. So this is what Patty brings to her study of history. I think most of us know her for any of the 3 books that she's written, Desert Passages, Encounter with the American Deserts. I think especially The Legacy of Conquest, The Unbroken Paths of the American West. It was published in 1987 and recently reissued. And Something in the Soil, Legacies and Reckonings in the New West. She's also the co-author of another book and the co-editor of 3 more. But she keeps even more busy with articles. Armloads and armloads. I stopped counting at 50. And I think what's most interesting about her articles is the titles, which I think tells you something about her as a historian. The one that Patty most often refers to is Dancing with Professors, The Trouble with Academic Prose, which was in the New York Times, which many of you recognize. But also, some of these also give us little insights into corners of interest, like Phantom Students, Diagnosis and Cure, which gets, I don't know if it still does, it used to get placed in the registration packets of Harvard University freshmen. And maybe that article later provided the insight into impure thoughts from impure places. She also seems to, I think, have a really good sense of who we need to listen to. What Raymond Chandler knew and Western historians forget. Or more important for me, because this is someone I find myself referring to a lot, fire alarm historians and Thorsten Veblen to the rescue. I also admire historians, and especially when I talk to graduate students, who think big, who are willing to really look at large places and questions, like the shadows of heaven itself. The repair of the earth and the redemption of the historical profession. Or, even larger, everything and the kitchen sink, enriching the U.S. history. She has also written approximately 200 newspaper columns in USA Today, the Salt Lake City Tribune, the Denver Post, Chronicle of Higher Education, New York Times, LA Times, and has also written things that I think have shaken people up a little bit. How many of you remember the controversy over the West as America, the exhibit at the Smithsonian, the Remington? It's worth going back, if you're doing anything with that in class, and it's an interesting thing to use as a teaching moment, if you can stand the prose on the labels, I guess. It's worth going back to her opening statement for the Forum of the West as America exhibit from 1991. And then there is Saving Professors from Themselves and Detoxifying Academic Prose, which we won't get into. Book reviews in 15 scholarly and popular periodicals and newspapers. And then the other thing I want to mention before giving way is that we're talking here about working with our communities and about the ways in which conversation with communities can enhance the history major. And we're going to be listening tonight to somebody whose vita includes the following: State Coordinator, Colorado History Day, volunteer Adult Literacy Program, Boulder Public Library, board member and discussion leader, Jefferson Meetings on the Constitution, Boulder, Colorado, selection panel, Denver Orchids and Onions competition for the People's Design Awards, Board of Trustees, Women of the West Museum, Boulder Rotary, Energy Outreach Colorado Board, Tesoro Foundation Advisory Board, Boulder Sesquicentennial Organizational Committee, Chautauqua Board of Directors. I bet very few people here even knew there still was a Chautauqua. Advisory Board for Wyoming Audubon Society Film Project, Collaborative Forest Landscape Restoration Program. So we have a scholar who's not only interested in teaching, in research, but who also understands how the relationship with the community informs what we teach. She has also been the official fool of Yale University, Harvard University, University of Colorado Boulder, and got a longer contract for being the official fool than the football coach. And those of us who follow college football know at the University of Colorado that's quite an accomplishment. So that's Patricia Limerick, and I now also want to introduce Patty Limerick, who is a friend and colleague whom I've gotten to know over the last few years after, for well over a decade, knowing the work of Patricia Limerick. I've gotten to know Patty first through mutual friends when I started consorting with historians of the American West a while ago, and then especially at the AHA. And that has been a distinct pleasure. The grant proposal for this project we wrote together, and for those of you who have ever co-authored something, you know that co-authoring when it works is almost like a drug. It's such a pleasure, and it works so smoothly, and it's such a wonderful experience. And that's what it was co-authoring with Patty, and it's an honor for me to have been able to do that and to be able to introduce her tonight.
So I will go forward with the time, and sadly, everything always brings up something else. That when Jim was talking about saying, well, my work is on such and so, I have been haunted since I was a kid. I think I must have been 20 or 21 when I read D.H. Lawrence's Studies in Classic American Literature, and D.H. Lawrence says there that when a writer refers to my work, Lawrence said, my flesh grows tired on my bones. Because I'm staying on Monday, because I have to go to the Bureau of Land Management and Interior. We have a big project which I think will be very beneficial for our undergraduates, commemorating the 200th anniversary of the founding of the General Land Office, which is the ancestor agency of the Bureau of Land Management. And we have a student congress, the BLM, the poor Bureau of Land Management, like so many agencies, has said, we want to involve young people. Well, the poor thing is they say we want to involve youth, which no young person has ever called himself or herself a youth decade. So you're kind of, well, okay. So the Bureau of Land Management paid for our students to do a course with a filmmaker studying the history of land management and making documentaries on that. And so we actually now have youth participation in the BLM. So anyway, I have to say for that, and there will be a student congress where our students will participate with students from around the country to have visions about the future of land policy management in the United States based on the past and their understanding of the past. So that's why I'm staying over. But it's another one of those examples about the things we can do when we go out of the boundaries with our... The chicken is not going with me to BLM. That's too much stuff about cattle over there. So we wouldn't want to do that. Well, and then... I want to make it really clear. Tonight I'm only speaking for myself. I am the Vice President of the American Historical Association. I'm going to give a spirited defense of the, actually not a defense, an aggressive assertion of the value of vocational thinking in this, and that is not, Jim bears no responsibility for that. And I'm also going to talk about bipartisan collaboration on behalf of education, and that might, I have no idea, probably, some of the members are not going to enjoy it. That part I think is true, but I know it to be important. So I'm proud to be a member of the AHA, and I am proud to have worked with Jim on this. When I was a kid, I got a prize. My senior year in college, I got a prize from a National Trade Association, and I went to a convention, never been anywhere near anything like it, a big convention at a hotel in San Francisco. Went to the banquet. I was the youngest person by far in the room. We had a speaker who was funny and engaging and so pleasant and just a delight. And then he was giving his opening remarks, and they were so funny, they were so pleasant, and then he sat down and the speech was over, and I turned to the adults at the table and I said, no, I just missed that. What was his subject? I didn't really get what he was talking about. It was certainly a pleasant thing to hear him. They said, oh, he doesn't have a subject matter, he's an inspirational speaker. At the time, I thought, well, that's a very ridiculous thing, and then I turned into that myself. So it's another case where I condemned I don't know if I condemned it, but I became that. It's also a little bit of sibling envy. In Banning, California, my big sisters, Carol and Sunny, were song leaders and cheerleaders, and I was not that. So this evening shows me it's not exactly sibling envy, it's just, well, maybe it is, actually. That this is really what I am here tonight, is cheerleader. Not song leader, that's the good news. They were both song leaders, but and then I want to say that this is genuine and authentic enthusiasm for tuning, and I'm going to be a little bit brief in making that point, but I want to talk about how well-timed this was for me personally. This project was the context of when this happen could not have been better. And then I want to talk briefly about the context of public perceptions of history and humanities education and how perfectly timed this project is for that as well. Then I will celebrate the useful chance that tuning presents to reflect on individualism as a custom and practice in this profession, and to examine that, just freshly, I guess. And then I will vigorously assert the value of vocationalism and bipartisanship and expand the concept of public historians in ways that some of the public historians who picked on Jim were not thinking as expansively as I think they might think. So that's particularly where I'm speaking for myself, because I think there's actually kind of a narrow definition of public history at work in those attacks on tuning. So that would be me, not Jim, speaking on that. And then I will attack the tuning project. I will attack Lumina for its one major area of complete incompatibility with history, with the discipline of history. I will just express shock and dismay over how incompatible tuning is with the discipline of history. And then, don't worry, because then I will show how easily repaired and remedied that is, to the benefit of the Lumina Foundation and the tuning project. But maybe it'll be really interesting to me if any of you thought of it. I did not think of it until last week, and I thought, how in God's name could it be that no one has attacked Jim Grossman for this? So I will attack Jim for
35 minutes?
No, I came. It was a long trip from Boulder, Colorado this morning for that. Okay, so the context. First, we'll do the bigger social context. These are tough times for. This will take no time at all to say because everyone knows it through and through. Tough times for higher education, maybe tougher times still for humanities higher education, and tough times for making the case for history. And then the sad fact that just has to be acknowledged, our profession has not done a great job of making our case, of making our own statements on why we matter, why this profession matters. That's the sad part. The great part is that tuning provides the occasion to do that. And it does require some terms that have been a little bit uncomfortable for our profession. I will be using shamelessly and comfortably and happily the term marketing, selling. I will be using those terms because I mean them, and I think a lot rests on our effective use of those practices. And I will say, so now I want to shift. Well, actually, I want to say that another misfortune is that some of the justifications for history that the public instantly leaps to and repeats endlessly are very goofy propositions. When they say history repeats itself, or they quote Santayana of those who do not know history are condemned to repeat it. That is goofy. I mean, that has nothing. That is a silly remark. That's the great Ferris wheel that we ride around and around and around on. It's so not what reflects what we are talking about. The contingency, the improbability that indeed certain patterns repeat, certain issues come up, but often very consciously played. We have every few years we have a rebellion in the West against public lands management. That's a staged performance. That's an intentional replay of history. That's not the Ferris wheel just operating. It's a bunch of people making a choice to replay some old scripts. So it's a little bit sad that our most often quoted justifications, we actually have to say, oh, thank you for that tribute, but quit it. It's kind of a tragic thing because they are so fatalistic. Those, just such so little room for the human will in those stories. So I have often had a good time. I'm sure we've all had some version of it, and I'm going to suggest several things where, if it should work out, that you could get your students in on this game. So we want to tell the public that history has an extraordinary record of unforeseeable consequences, implausibility, improbability, and so how do we make that case? I've had success with the Astonish the Immigrant party game concept, where you are going to bring a 19th century, mid-19th century pioneer back from the past, or you're bringing him into the future from the past, and the competition is to find the thing in our time that would most astonish the pioneer. And I would not waste my time with the internet because I think the telegraph is thematically close enough. And so a lot of the things that seem, that would be astonishing in our time, I wouldn't bother with that. What I would do, my own nomination, I think it would win, I would bring it's my game. but I'm tired of this particular one. I've said it too many times, and I want a fresh thing. So I want your students to come up with astonishing episodes of implausibility. Okay, so I'm going to take my immigrant to a courtroom where a case is being tried involving predator management. And I'm going to stand with my pioneer in the back, because every pioneer who had any dependence on livestock, which was the better share of them, felt they had to get rid of the predators in order for their livestock and their family well-being to take hold. So getting rid of coyotes and bears and wolves and cougars and so on was a very big priority. So my pioneer and I are going to the back of the courtroom, and I'm going to stand with the pioneer, and I'm going to say, over here we have attorneys, on this side we have attorneys who went to law school to come to court and represent coyotes. And win. My wonderful friend Helena Wall at Pomona College, I told her that one time, and she said, so I said, so then I say, in our time, to the pioneer, I say, in our time, predators have their own attorneys. Well, I said that to Helena, and she said, well, predators have always had attorneys, it's just that they were human predators. So I just think it would be cool if out of this group of people were sending me messages where their students had come up with things that were equally and probably more improbable that people at the time could not have seen coming. So getting improbability and implausibility and contingency back in, that means we have to in some ways fight the people who make the case for us in public. History repeats itself, we must prepare for the next round on the Ferris wheel. Well, no. Okay, so now the personal context for me, why tuning came at such a good time. This seemed like a good idea when I wrote this down, but this is the story of the return of the prodigal daughter. And this is a confession that I did kind of take the administrative route for a while there, and I was very pulled in by interdisciplinary attractions and teamed up with scientists and all kinds of people, and called my courses Western American Studies rather than Western American History, and I certainly spent a lot of time in public engagement working with federal agencies and so on. And the result of that is that I taught small classes, and I taught much less of them many fewer of them than I had before. And about 2 years ago, I thought, I don't think this is when I turned 60, I thought, this is not the way I want the next years to be. So I went back into a large lecture class format with 220 students. Seemed like a good idea. It was a good idea. I did that a year ago this spring. It went pretty well, but it was hard. And I was headed back into that the third week of January this year. I was going back into to the big lecture class. The tuning workshop in Denver occurred the weekend before classes started. And that didn't seem like a happy situation to me. And I thought, man, on top of everything else, now I have to go spend the weekend talking about learning outcomes. And what I did not see coming was the incredibly great company I was going to be in, and I did not notice how long it had been since I had sat with colleagues and comrades and learned from them. So I enjoyed it tremendously, and I was totally psyched for the start of the school year. I was really put into a mood where I could say to myself what I could certainly have said many times over the last decades of, you have developed some stupid habits that you cling to in a classroom, and you don't even know where you got these stupid habits, and you have had a lot of evidence that they're not working really well. So might you want to dump some of them? So that's what I did. I jettisoned a slew of habits, which was a little bit terrifying because then I had very few habits. An unnerving situation. But I kind of surfed on the momentum from the group in Denver. And that, I said I would attack Lumina in a bigger way, but right now I will attack Lumina in their tuning guide because the word joy never appears there, the word pleasure. There's a funny statement in there. I was drowsy by the time I got to it. I mean, there's nothing about the fun that this activity can involve, and that's a pretty serious omission from a document. So, and this is not the AHA speaking, this is me saying, think about that, writers of the tuning guide. Think about what you have that you in fact are bringing people into a state where joy can occur, where at the very least encouragement and morale can build and so on. So why not acknowledge that? Okay, so that's the personal context, was that I then went into my class ready to, well, having recognized that I had a disturbing pattern underway where I sometimes, if somebody said to me, if a person said to me, well, what are the students like today? I would start on a set piece that irritated me, that bored me, but I could not stop myself. I would say, well, it's very difficult. You get the top 20% are very motivated, but the rest, oh, I don't know, they don't even come to class sometimes, they don't seem to read, and I thought, I have become an old grouch. And this is, I remember old grouches from when I was the kid being denounced, when I was the young person who was a great disappointment, and now I'm just in the most horrible way echoing them. So I just cut myself off from that. In January, mid-January, I just said, shut up about that. And I think that was a great relief to Boulder, Colorado, to not have to hear me say that stupid thing again. But it also just gave me a very excellent opportunity to say, I could give many examples, but I'm going to give one, that we had a student, I had one graduate student working with me in this big course, and we wrote endless comments on the papers. We had 400-word essays, 220 of them, and I wrote at least 1.5 page of typed comments on each paper. And one student, that's a miracle, only one student came in and talked to Adrian, my partner, and he was very angry that I had written all these comments. He's always done well on papers, and this was so wrong that I had written all these comments. Oh man, I wrote these comments. So then he came up to me and picked up another paper, different paper for a different assignment on the last day of class, and he did not like his grade, and he left, and then he came back in, and he said, you did not describe this assignment well. I don't like this grade, but I got this grade because your description of this assignment was not clear. So, well, I do my best on that. And I kept my temper, not well, but I kept my temper, and then I went back to my office, and I thought, I noticed his grades. He had good grades on the tests, and I thought, something is there that I should pay attention to. I could take him, if I still had my old narrative of complaints set up and running, I could put him in there. You write all these comments on papers, and then they just come in and complain because you've written too many comments and tried to help them too much, they didn't want to be helped. So I could have done that. Instead, I took a number of deep breaths, and then I wrote Adam, and I said, I was just following up on our conversation, that it was a very difficult thing, which God knows everybody in the room could have signed on to this letter, to write an assignment that describes the assignment, but then doesn't get you 220 copies of the same thing. If you over-describe, right, then you then you have the same response to that. And that I have been working on that for ages, but if Adam wanted to come in, if he was available tomorrow afternoon, I would be in the office. Maybe he could come in and help me figure out how to get that better worked out with this particular assignment. The response that came back to me was so, you could ask for ID at that point. Adam wrote back and he said, thank you so much for that message. I would love to come talk to you. I am free tomorrow afternoon, and any time would work well for me. I can't wait to be in. So he came in, we had a very nice conversation, and his summer assignment, which he accepted willingly and gladly, is to rewrite that assignment so that it won't. So anyway, so there were lots of those experiments going on, and that was great, and I truly give the tuning conversation a good share of the credit for those changes in spirit, because it was, speaking of agency, it was just, it's really, Adam is not in charge of that class, and it is really my joy to have the chance to say, I choose not to go down this route of crabbiness. Okay, so that's, could go on, but there's a lot of this personal context of how much this meant to me. The rubber chicken came because John came up to me. He's a kid, sits in the front row, doesn't take notes, does really well on tests. So when I talked to him, I said, how do you do that? He said, I just have mind, I've always been able to do that. Works 30 hours a week, outside of class. This is, again, what I got by spending more time having to come in individually. His mother has been off and on in her employment, so some of his money goes for her apartment. His 12-year-old little brother had fractured his ankle, and the doctors thought that there was a weakness in the ankle that might be bone cancer, and they were testing for that. So when Jonathan said to me, I know Jonathan to be a person on the planet working hard. He said to me, it's hard for us in this class. He comes up after class. It's hard for us because the class is from 3:30 to 4:45, and we get pretty drowsy, and it's hard for us to sit all that time, and so you should have an intermission. Intermission? That's not going to work. I mean, how in God's name would you get them back in after your intermission? Plus, it's a tuition time that they're paying for. So I said, okay, Jonathan, I don't think I can do that, but I will get back to you. I'm going to think about that. And so I rushed downtown and I got the chicken. I'm not going to... Should I explain? No, I'm not going to explain. The chicken solved the problem. We'll just say that. Because it is a long time to sit still. I'm trying to do all kinds of interactive stuff, but that's a long time. So here's what you do. I'll tell you what you do with this chicken. You think of a question that they're not going to be comfortable answering. So if I have obviously loved an assigned reading, they're not going to want to say that they didn't like the reading or didn't find it interesting. So you think of a question that they would prefer to answer when I can't pay rapt attention to who's speaking. So when they look drowsy after 35 or 40 minutes, you have everybody stand up, mostly freshmen, so they can think, well, maybe this happens in college, I don't know. So everybody stands up, and then I ask the question, did the reading for this class, did it change your opinion of immigration? Did it, do you have the same opinion you had before? And then I throw the chicken into the room, and whoever receives the chicken, what's very funny is that I think there's something about human nature. You don't, even though you know a chicken is flying through the room, you don't really think it's going to hit you. So the chicken is fairly solidly cocked. The chicken usually is kind of... could be worse, it's not helpful. This chicken is too harsh. It's kind of... well, it just needs to be a softer chicken. But so and then as you catch the chicken, you shout out the answer. And quite a number of kids did say didn't at all or didn't really learn much from it. But before I can focus on them and notice who said it, then they are to throw the chicken back into the room, and it has the effect an intermission would have of having people standing up and active, but it also generates information. It tells me something that I may or may not have wanted to know, but it did that. So the chicken, there's a chance in a moment that we will use the chicken here, but work on that. Okay, very quickly, I want to say that I think what I personally probably value the most in this whole thing, outside of obviously what I value the most is that it really got me perked up as a teacher. But what I also value is the way in which the tuning project challenges a habitual individualism. A friend of mine in business once said, professors and instructors, they're really independent contractors. They really don't feel that there's, well, just everything you said about the where does my course fit in the larger thing. And I think the students lose by that, and I think we lose by that as well. I am a Rotarian, and which... That was an interesting thing. When they in the history department, they announced when you get a book prize or something at a department meeting. So when I was inducted into Boulder Rotary, I asked the chair of the department to announce that I was a Rotarian, and he did. And the smirking and snarking started. And before it just barely got started. And the Chicana scholar leapt in there, and she said, Rotary has done more for international understanding among young people than any other entity or organization. Those Rotary Youth Scholarships are astonishing. So she shut them up. So that was a fun Rotarian moment there. But I am a joiner, and I do like community. I do like the fact that Rotary has almost gotten rid of polio on the planet. I like that sense of common enterprise. And I think we miss something when we don't give us that opportunity. So our document coming out of Denver does have one result as to what historians do. Historians value individual effort and collaborative work as vital to knowing the past better. A little prosaic, but really a spirit-lifting notion that we recognize individual and collaborative effort in there. And that, I believe, shines a light on the unexamined individualism of our profession. Tuning in the guide, it says that it makes assumptions explicit, and that is a comfortable process sometimes and an uncomfortable process other times. And this seems to me uncomfortable maybe as a phase, but then really comfortable and really beneficial when you make your peace with that. We actually have, I don't know, I'll say it for myself, I don't know I was going to speak for everyone. That's a preposterous idea, but we'll find out here. It's lonely in the front of a lecture hall. There's a lot of other people in the room. They do not bear the responsibility that you do. And there is a tremendous sense of being, I don't know what, just alone. And if you could then go from that to places where other people were speaking directly to you about their own challenges with that, when it's just going flat and you have an excellent plan and it's not happening and you are so visibly struggling and the senior auditors are weeping for you in the back and you're just kind of turning around. It's something that the camaraderie could be so restorative if we could have that more often. So there would be considerable benefit and encouragement and consolation, I think, if we could take this open door with tuning. So I felt more and more when I started 2 years ago when I was doing the big lecture class, walking around the AHA hallways, knowing I was going back into that different form. I thought, people I'm passing at the convention know things that I need to know, and they are going to be weirded out if I grab their lapels and beg them to tell me what they know. But I knew that if I could find a way in Boston to get a sandwich board, professor old enough to know better still needs help, or I don't know, something that would have worked there. But I could not find any mechanism for doing that. We will be launching a teaching tips website, which is very compatible with Lumen. I'd be happy to talk more about that as well. But that was kind of my response to that. These people know things, and I need to find a way to get them to tell me those things. So now I think I'm about ready to shift to whacking away at some of the... I just want to say that one more thing with tuning was exactly that thing that Jim had mentioned about the outcomes, that I have really been cryptic and cagey about what I'm expecting from students, and I did not even notice that how much I was doing. I made fun of it. I used the phrase of guess what's on teacher's mind, and I was so irritated when students would say, now what's going to be on the test? But as I look at that now, I think that's really they're saying, could you give us some sense of what we're doing here together? And that's really, that turned out to be really funny. I had a technique that works really well, which I'll stick with forever, which is I walk around the room. My nephew is a high school teacher, and he said, you don't just stand at a podium in the big lecture class. He said, don't do that. The students cannot know the back from the front. You got to be moving around all the time. So now I walk madly up one aisle and the other aisle. And it seems like very eccentric pacing, but it seems to be taken in as a thing that, well, I guess eccentric is something that they're already convinced I am. So that's not a big deal. But in pacing around, I actually I can walk up to a row of students who did not expect me to arrive at their row. It's a little bit like the chicken landing, and I ask a question, and I say, answer in a sentence, and I pass the microphone down that row, and everybody has to respond, and then I go over and pick up the microphone at the other end. So I said to the students, rather than do my usual complaining to myself about the fact that they had asked what was going to be on the test, or some of them had, I had a PowerPoint slide that said, imagine that I am about to tell you what will be on the test next week, and then I'm going to give you the questions, and I'm going to give you the answers to memorize. What would your response be? So then I walked up to an aisle, to a row, and passed the microphone down, and to a person, all the students said, we think that would be good. That would be great. But this passing the microphone thing, usually, almost every episode, somebody says something that is so funny and quotable. The young man at the end said, I would call my mom and I would tell her I finally found a class I love. So I said, I'm not going to do that because, in fact, this is an important thing to get to where I'm going in a second here. I was shamelessly vocational in my remarks to these students. I just said, do you think, after we had the responses, do you think that when you go for job interviews, the employer will send you a list of the questions with the answers to memorize before you arrive? So I'm asking you to spend a little time, and I would stand by this. You'll notice I use the word important every now and then. It's a little bit of a clue. So I actually tried to pitch it as a job skill thing. But anyway, I do think I need to be much more explicit about what are those outcomes and where are the emphases falling. Okay, so now I have have a very interesting remark that I'm trying to decide what I'm going to cut, but this is so interesting that I'm going to put it in, which is thinking about this and anticipating this talk, I thought, boy, I think we are what this big historical story that Lumina and tuning comes in on, I think it's our still working it out with the 1960s problem. Because I was in college, I started college in 1968. My second year at Santa Cruz, I took a course on medieval religious history. The professor said that it was inappropriate and wrong and tyrannical to dictate to us what we must learn. So we were to go find what we wanted to learn and learn it. Medieval religious history. And now, of course, you have to say, well, he must have had a relaxing semester. Well, he's a very brilliant man. It wasn't a calamity because I went to the library and I found biographies of saints. So I started reading biographies of saints, and then I wrote a paper about biographies of saints. But that whole, we mustn't dictate, we mustn't try to exert power over you, and so on, that's still hanging, certainly for someone of my vintage, it's not just hanging in the air, it's in my bloodstream still. And so just that recognition that, in fact, that is my class, and saying, well, you'll have to make your own choices on what you're going to learn, that's goofy in itself. So I feel that the Lumina thing comes in on that whole lingering 60s notion. It occurs, this has made me realize how I had put off arriving at a settled understanding of my own authority in a classroom of what I could and should ask of students. So now I'm going to respond to 2 or 3 of the criticisms, and then I shall attack Lumina, and then I'll be finished. So the first one that, well, not finished in that sense, but just with the top. Okay, the first objection, and this is totally me speaking, the public historians wrote some angry things about the fact that public historians are not sitting here among us. Well, and 1 or 2 of them said, well, we see this is about people who teach the classes. It's not about, this is not the gathering of the alumni who are telling about, so they got that, but they were still very injured that we were not having the public historians here to talk about the what we could be teaching in historic preservation methods or assessment of cultural sites and so on that would be applied skills for public historians. Their writing, the 2 or 3 who I read on that, depressed me because it was such a narrow definition of public history. It was historical societies, museums, historic preservation. It was a very narrow definition of public history. They had, I felt, sold that whole concept short, and I will be happy, anybody who knows any of the people of whom I'm going to, 1 or 2 I might quote by name. I love panels and conversations where I get to insult somebody when they're not here and then have a chance to talk to them later. So if you do know any of these public historians, tell them I'll be happy to go there and chat with them. But it is way beyond museums and historical societies. Right now, the open door of history's utility is so much beyond that with a public audience. Our slogan, the Senate of the American West has on its cards and on its t-shirts, turning hindsight into foresight. And we have extraordinary receptivity from the public on that. I mean, there's a history of everything, of every enterprise, and there is, well, every enterprise on the planet would work better if its participants could understand themselves in time, could see how they could be, we're talking about everything from the Forest Service to natural gas producers to immigration advocates. Everybody would do better at what they're doing if they could think in time, which is indeed our property. The receptivity to that is just beyond characterizing. It is so enormous. They will look at you with lamb-like trust when you go to the Forest Service leadership. Oh, the historian will help us. I don't know, I hope so. But that is so wide and expansive. Public officials love to be invited into classrooms. They really melt over the chance to talk to students. I didn't think this through, and so in 2005, I wrote a New York Times op-ed piece where I offered to fly to Washington at my own expense to meet with Secretary Rumsfeld to talk about the Indian Wars. We wouldn't talk about Iraq, the invasion of Iraq, but I felt that so many of the issues of the Indian Wars, not history repeating itself, but the notion that if you go in and the folks are going to be really happy that you came in to invade and conquer them. That there were lessons that I felt Secretary Rumsfeld could benefit from, and if he would give me any indication, I would be there to talk to him about the Indian Wars. And again, I'm not a foreign policy expert, so I wouldn't do the least but just what I thought we might learn from those wars. Well, he didn't call. Right. But I did go, this is an interesting story in itself, which we won't dwell on, but I did give a speech at the Bush White House before the war started. Laura Bush had a really great series on writers. She did the Harlem Renaissance, and she was doing some stuff. I was there speaking on Western women writers, and during the break, I started chatting with a lady who we didn't have name tags on, and she said that she loved the West and that she and her husband had to leave the West, and they were so sad when they had to come back to Washington. And I said, "Oh, why did you have to come back to Washington?" And she said, "I'm Joyce Rumsfeld." Why don't you go back to the West? But what I should have said, oh, and she's, by the way, she's a University of Colorado undergraduate, so I should have said, "Oh, Mrs. Rumsfeld, when would you and your husband be free to come to my class? We're doing a unit on the Indian Wars, and it would be so interesting to have Secretary Rumsfeld come and join us in a conversation. You get the kiddos prepared for that?" Well, I'm not sure we would have saved any lives, but I didn't save any lives by not doing it. I know that. So the kids can be incredible agents of disarmament. If you bring in a public official, and there is no public official, local or national or federal or state or whatever, who is not going to profit from knowing something about the Progressive Era or whatever, or the Enlightenment, or they need to know that stuff. So bring them into the class and then have the students prep to educate them. It's such a, I mean, they have to talk for a little while. You have to let them talk. But then the students are so much more effective at getting their attention and bringing out the better angels of their nature. I don't know, Secretary Rumsfeld, how well those angels were doing, but I should have given it a try. So there's all kinds of wonderful ways in which we can use history, make it public, that does not involve working in a museum or a historical society, or it can involve that. But there's so many open doors for creative young people to respond to that desire to see where we are in time and to place ourselves in time, which now brings me to my support for vocationalism. I truly do not know where it started, the idea that there was something corrupt and contaminated about helping young people have ways to support themselves in the future and satisfying careers. It doesn't work for me. And curiously, it doesn't work for me because of things I learned in history classes. The word calling, the root of vocation. It's not about prostituting yourself. It's having a sense of, well, in fact, so I think what must have happened is we got stuck on the first definition, a particular occupation, business, or profession, or a strong impulse or inclination to follow a particular activity or career, and then, of course, a divine call to God's service. So to turn it into a contaminated thing to help a young person get better position for supporting herself, her children, why did that turn into a form of sin? We would fail to do the best we could for young people and their future because we do not like global capitalism. We do that. When you guys meet with the local employers, you're meeting with local employers. You're not, I don't know if we're planning to go to Salomon Brothers, but I recommend you don't. On that, although I'm going to get to that in a second. So foreclosing the students' own choices in a paternalistic manner, that's somehow compatible with helping students to think for themselves and reach their own conclusions. So that's the ethics of that are, I think, chilling. To use the students as the battering rams to fight our social and cultural battles. Plus, here's the really important part. What could be a better treatment program for global capitalism than to unleash a flood of thoughtful, well-educated history majors into the corporate world? How could you reform, if you think of different ways you could reform Wall Street? Well, there's all kinds of regulatory structures and so on, but history majors as the redemption of American finance, that seems more viable than a lot of other proposals I've heard from that. So, okay, so that is my support. It's not. Okay, so then at this point, I think we're running out of time, so we're not going to do that. Oh, no, we can do it. Okay. So, all right, ready? Okay, so you are going to respond in an honest way, because I won't be able to pay attention. Not that I wouldn't have any vindictive streaks or anything like it, but you are going to say whether my remarks on behalf of vocationalism and education in support of them and attacking the critics, whether you find them convincing or over the top or a betrayal of the basic and central values of the humanities. You can say whatever you would like with this. You can say that they are the remarks of a pathetic servant of global capitalism, if you like. You can do anything like that. Okay, ready?
It's my foot. I love it, Patty. Here.
You love it. See, that's a slippery chicken there.
It's refreshing.
No, you can say.
It's my turn.
Yeah.
I'm speechless.
You
No, I think the argument, the other question would be whether you can serve Main Street at the same time you live on Main Street. If you don't live on Main Street, where are they going to live?
I'm not a historian. Even better. I think paying attention to the sort of vocational thinking that students are engaged in is important. But to balance that with preserving the integrity of a curriculum is also important. So it's about balancing those two interests.
You back there, those people back there are feeling too safe.
Do we expect people to be unemployed? Or are we trying to raise unemployed or graduate unemployed? We're doing a good job on that already, but maybe we should be aiming for something more.
Yes. We have to balance these things. We can't assume that we know better than our students about what their future should be. I think that when we think about, I teach at community college, there's a great deal of discussion about meeting students where they are. One of the places they are is interested in locating their own futures financially. And one of the things that I think we have to be dedicated to doing if we're interested in undergraduate education is making history and an appreciation of history part of that picture, even if they don't become historians.
Everybody knows a chicken is flying around.
Okay, it hit me. Nothing you said is that radical.
It seemed like it.
We've been doing this for a long time.
Yeah. And so really, it's...
And I kind of think I'm a public historian, so...
Yay, so we got one. We have a public historian here. Okay, so the chicken is going to say with you, if you would just make it comfortable. Oh, no, actually, I think we'll, yeah, if you wouldn't mind just holding the chicken. The chicken will be happy on the floor, but it does occur to me I probably should finish this up. So I would like to just say a word about the politics of ALEC and Lumina's support for that. When I was an assistant professor at Harvard, the dean of students at Harvard had a joyful occasion of telling me a story, which he knew would rattle me very much. I was 28 or 29 then, and that's back when my purity days, I guess, where I had a clear view of this. So he said that every year, 7 or 8 Harvard students come into the dean of students, and they say, we can no longer take our family's money. The student will say, I've thought about how my granddad made his fortune and the cruelty to labor or the injury to the environment, and I can no longer take my family's money. I'll have to apply for financial aid. And then the dean of Harvard would say to the student, and where do you think Harvard gets its money for financial aid? So that was hard on me at 28 or 29, but I'm glad he did that, Dean Fox. I appreciate that. And now, I guess my feeling is, of course we will have impure political alliances. We better. This is not a thing. This is not a campaign to fight with a rejection of allies. That's a state of prosperity that we are not in. So here is my proposition, that alliances with unexpected, or people who were once our opponents, that's disorienting, but it's okay. If Republicans and Democrats cannot agree that in the current economic situation and with the growing burden of student debt, if Republicans and Democrats cannot agree that we should do all that is in our domain to enhance the employability of young people, then we are, as a nation, in unbelievably sorry shape. We cannot rally to that cause. The Center of the American West is about to have, with the permission of the Pinchot Institute, T-shirts that have Gifford Pinchot's statement from the fight for conservation in 1910. Pinchot, on I think page 140, says, "It is a greater thing to be a good citizen than to be a good Democrat or a good Republican." Gifford Pinchot, 1910. Soon available, in a month or so, available on Center of the American West website. And God willing, out there in time before, when the election crabbiness really begins to escalate on that. It is amazing the number of people, many walks of life, who've expressed a desire, kind of a desperate desire for that T-shirt. So, okay, now I'm going to attack. Let's skip that part. Okay, those are gone. Now I shall attack the very big problem with tuning in the profession of history, and I missed it until last week, but then I got it. This is a very big objection, and nobody, as far as I know, has raised it, but as I say, it's also very manageable and very addressable. The very big problem of applying tuning to the discipline of history is, well, I'm going to say, our core strength as a discipline is stories and narrative. That's what we have. And yet, we've agreed to surrender that strength and asset for this exercise. We are to write down the qualities of the discipline core. We are to write a list of learning outcomes. This is not our discipline's form of expression. Thank the Lord we are not known for the quality of our lists. So, we are becoming inadvertent political scientists. Sorry. We are, in defining our discipline, we are giving up our most important practice. Okay, that's the bad news. But it's so easy to resolve. We go ahead and do the lists. Those are good. Those actually, I find them useful. They're good lists. I don't mind those lists. But, so we comply with luminous procedures, because there's nothing lost in that. But we create, out of this process, and as you can consider, not as you choose on this, we create a parallel and better document, a collection of narratives and stories showing these themes at work. So, we show what conscious and intentional and volitional change is like in practice. And in this room, the stories are there. You have seen, everybody here has an abundance of stories of a student, sometimes who began a semester unable to think outside the present moment and then really got to Herodotus, got back, and knew that there would be a future as long as the past had been. In some cases, you've seen it that day. You've seen a student start the day without that capacity and end the day with that capacity. And those students have names, and they have character, and they have individuality, and that is our document. We do the other thing. We do the list because that's a perfectly valuable thing to do. But we put in these stories as well. And then we have got it back into compatibility. At that point, we actually have got the tuning process right hooked into our world. So these are, well, and really I'll just say further that there are elements beyond the reach of a list that history offers to human beings of any and every age, but history does bring the dead back into our reach and recognition. We do lend our vitality to the dead to bring them back in for our consideration. There's a story of a little boy taken to the Supreme Court by his father, and he sat watching the justices, and it was very solemn, and then a fly came into the chamber and circled around the room and then landed on the forehead of one of the justices, and the justice reached up and brushed it away, and the little boy grabbed his father's arm and he said, look, 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 did you see that? One of them is alive. That moment when a young person really gets the idea that a person was once young and then was middle-aged and then was old and then died, that is a very remarkable moment of the human consciousness at work there. So that's a hard thing to put on a list, but it's got to be in our stories. It's got to be one of the things we put in our stories. So, I don't need to tell that story about channeling Gifford Pinchot. I can't do that. Okay. So, we can fit a full reckoning with human mortality, with the precariousness of human life, with the brevity of our time on the planet. We can fit that into a description of our disciplinary core and into our list of competencies, but we can really, it seems a little paradoxical as phrasing, we can bring that to life with stories and narratives that accompany that list. But I would also make a case for making sure we have humor and merriment and festivity and joy in the time that we have together as mortals on the planet and that others before us have had. The same element of being very present and very fully alive. We can get that into our lists as well. They also need a place, those festive and merry aspects of life need a place in the disciplinary core and in the competencies. And in that spirit, I end with 2 limericks that in themselves, I think, represent change over time as I have experienced it. The first one was written for the business meeting of the American Historical Association a year and a half ago. And it was the American Historical Association Vice President reporting, "I've been given the privilege to preach the value of historians who teach, but the times are so rough and the job seems so rough that it's tempting to give up and screech." So that's me a year and a half ago. And then this was written at the tuning event, so several have already heard this, in January in Denver. "As we take up the mission to tune, we bravely reach for the moon. We'll train masters of narrative who are humble and comparative, and our departments will love us all soon."